In July 2026, a scientific paper quietly appeared in one of the world's most respected research journals, and within days, it had triggered a wave of confused, emotional, and sometimes angry reactions across Vietnamese social media. The paper came from a massive new research effort called VN1K, built from the full genetic code of over 1,000 ordinary Vietnamese people, the biggest and most detailed genome study Vietnam has ever produced. Scientists had spent years collecting blood samples, sequencing DNA letter by letter, and comparing the genetic code of people from the northern mountains, the central highlands, and the Mekong Delta in the south. And when the results finally came out, they did not confirm what millions of people had grown up believing about their own bloodline. For generations, the story taught in schools and passed down at family dinner tables was simple. Vietnamese people came from Vietnamese people, a single unbroken line stretching back into the deep past, separate and distinct from every neighboring country, especially the giant to the north, China. But the DNA told a much stranger, much more complicated story, one built from multiple ancient migrations, multiple waves of mixing, and multiple deep connections to places most people would never expect. Comment sections filled up overnight. People began questioning family legends they had heard their whole lives. Some felt proud, some felt confused, some felt genuinely unsettled, as if a piece of their identity had just shifted under their feet without warning. So today we are going to properly unpack this story, using real published science, not social media rumors or half-explained headlines. We are going to trace the actual genetic history of the Vietnamese people, starting from the very first humans who ever set foot in Southeast Asia, all the way through thousands of years of migration, farming revolutions, Bronze Age kingdoms, and modern DNA testing that is rewriting the textbook version of where Vietnamese ancestry truly comes from. And I promise you, once you hear the full picture, you will understand exactly why this story caused so much shock, so much pride, and so much heated debate the moment it went public. Because the real answer to where Vietnamese people come from is not one simple story. It is layers upon layers of human history, stacked on top of each other over tens of thousands of years, and almost none of it matches the simple version most people were taught growing up. Let's start at the very beginning, because the roots of this story go back much further than most people ever imagine. Long before Vietnam existed as a country, long before rice fields, long before anyone had ever heard the word Vietnamese. Around 44,000 years ago, a wave of early modern humans began moving out of Africa, following what researchers call the Southern Dispersal Route, a long, slow migration hugging the coastlines of South Asia before pushing into the dense tropical forests of what we now call mainland Southeast Asia. These were not farmers. They were not building cities or writing history. They were hunter-gatherers, small mobile groups moving through jungles and river valleys, surviving off the land, adapting to one of the most biologically rich and challenging environments on Earth. Archaeologists refer to these early Southeast Asian populations using a term you might not have heard before, calling their distinctive stone tool culture the Ho Binh Hien tradition, named after the region in northern Vietnam, where their tools were first discovered in large numbers. These Ho Binh Hien hunter-gatherers were the first layer, the very foundation of human presence in this part of the world, arriving tens of thousands of years before anything resembling the modern nations of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, or Thailand ever existed. For an incredibly long stretch of time, these hunter-gatherer populations lived across the region relatively undisturbed, adapting their tools, their hunting methods, and their knowledge of the forest across countless generations. If you had told them that one day their descendants would build rice terraces, bronze drums, and eventually entire kingdoms, they would have had no framework to even imagine it. But then, starting somewhere around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, everything began to change. And this is where the real twist in the Vietnamese origin story begins. The twist that caused so much shock when it resurfaced in modern genetic research. A completely new wave of people began moving south into Southeast Asia. And this time, they were not simple hunter-gatherers wandering through the forest. They were farmers, carrying with them one of the most transformative technologies in all of human history, the cultivation of rice. The second wave of migrants is believed by researchers to have originated from populations connected to the Yangtze River Basin, a major river system running through what is today central and eastern China. These farming populations brought agricultural knowledge, new tools, new pottery styles, and crucially, they brought their own distinct genetic ancestry, one that was noticeably different from the older Ho Binh Hien hunter-gatherer populations already living across Southeast Asia. As these farming communities pushed further south over many generations, following river valleys and fertile lowlands, they gradually encountered, interacted with, and in many cases mixed with the descendants of those original hunter-gatherer populations who had been living in the region for tens of thousands of years already. This is now widely known among population geneticists, studying the region as the two-layer model of Southeast Asian ancestry, meaning the genetic makeup of most people living in Vietnam and neighboring countries today, is not a single, pure, unbroken line, but rather a blend, a genetic layer cake built from at least two very different ancient populations that mixed together over thousands of years of contact. Here is exactly why this detail creates so much tension when it becomes public knowledge. Ancestry linked to the Yangtze River Basin in ancient China is a major component of the genetic ancestry carried by many people across Vietnam and much of mainland Southeast Asia today. For a country whose modern national identity has often been built, at least in part, on the idea of being fundamentally separate and independent from China, culturally, politically, and historically, a scientific finding suggesting that a significant portion of the ancestral genetic layer came from ancient farming populations, connected to Chinese river valleys, thousands of years ago, lands very differently in the public imagination than it does in a quiet academic journal. It is important to be precise here, because this is exactly the kind of detail that gets exaggerated or misunderstood online. This is not about modern China. It is not about recent history, colonization, or anything connected to the last few centuries. This is about extremely ancient population movements from 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, long before the country of China as we understand it today even existed, involving farming communities whose descendants eventually became the ancestors of many different populations spread across a huge swath of East and Southeast Asia, not just Vietnam. But even with that important context, the emotional reaction to this kind of finding is completely understandable, because questions about ancestry are never just about biology. They are tangled up with identity, national pride, and centuries of complicated history between Vietnam and its northern neighbor. Now, let's add another layer to this story, because the two-layer model, hunter-gatherers plus farmers, is actually still an oversimplified version of what modern genetic research has uncovered. Researchers studying Vietnam's genetic diversity in detail have found that the country's ancestry is genuinely one of the most complex and varied in all of mainland Southeast Asia, shaped by far more than just two ancient migration waves. Vietnam is home to over 50 officially recognized ethnic groups, and remarkably, these groups collectively speak languages belonging to all 5 of the major language families found across mainland Southeast Asia, a level of linguistic diversity packed into one country that is genuinely rare anywhere on Earth. There is Austroasiatic, the language family that includes Vietnamese itself, the language spoken by the majority Kinh population. There is Thai Kadai, connected to populations with deep historical ties spreading across what is now southern China, Thailand, and Laos. There is Hmong Mien, associated with mountain-dwelling communities found across a wide stretch of the region. There is Austronesian, connected to seafaring populations whose ancestors are believed to have originated from Taiwan before spreading across the Pacific and into island Southeast Asia. And, remarkably, some of those Austronesian-speaking communities settled along the central coast of Vietnam itself, becoming the ancestors of groups like the Cham people. And finally, there is Sino-Tibetan, connected to populations with historical roots stretching toward the Tibetan Plateau in southern China. When scientists compared the actual genetic data of people belonging to these different language families across Vietnam, they discovered something that genuinely surprised even the researchers themselves. Genetic ancestry did not neatly match up with language in the way many people would naturally assume. In other words, just because two ethnic groups in Vietnam speak languages from completely different families does not necessarily mean their genetic ancestry is dramatically different. And just because two groups speak closely related languages does not guarantee they share particularly close genetic ancestry either. Researchers specifically found extensive interactions and genetic mixing between the Hmong Mien and Thai Kadai speaking groups in Vietnam, populations whose languages come from entirely separate families, but whose DNA tells a story of repeated historical contact, intermarriage, and mixing across many generations. This finding directly contradicted an older, simpler theory that many earlier researchers had proposed. The idea that Vietnamese ethnic ancestry could largely be explained as a purely indigenous, locally developed population, with minimal outside mixing. The real data showed the opposite. Vietnamese genetic diversity carries the fingerprints of multiple distinct migration waves and repeated contact between different populations, layered on top of each other over thousands of years. Not one clean, isolated bloodline, quietly developing on its own in one corner of Southeast Asia. There's another genuinely fascinating twist buried in this research that connects Vietnam to a completely unexpected part of the world. And it involves those Austronesian-speaking communities we just mentioned along the central coast. The broader Austronesian language family, which includes languages spoken not just in parts of Vietnam, but across a truly enormous stretch of the planet, from Madagascar, off the coast of Africa, through Indonesia, the Philippines, and all the way out into the remote islands of the Pacific Ocean, including Hawaii and New Zealand, is believed by researchers to have originated from a relatively small population based in Taiwan, roughly 5,000 years ago. From that starting point, these seafaring populations spread across thousands of miles of open ocean using nothing but early sailing technology, eventually reaching Madagascar on one side of the world and Easter Island on the other, one of the most extraordinary maritime migrations in all of human history. A branch of the same ancient seafaring population settled along the coastline of what is now central Vietnam, eventually developing into the ancestors of the Cham people in the historic Kingdom of Champa, meaning a portion of Vietnam's population today carries genetic and linguistic threads connecting them not primarily to inland Asia, but to a vast oceanic migration story stretching across 2 entire oceans. Let's talk about the Bronze Age now, because this is where the story shifts from ancient prehistoric migration into something people in Vietnam actually recognize as part of their proud, celebrated national history. And it turns out, even this celebrated era carries genetic complexity most people never think about. Around 2,500 years ago, a sophisticated Bronze Age culture flourished in northern Vietnam, known today as the Dong Son culture, famous for producing extraordinary bronze drums covered in intricate engravings depicting boats, warriors, birds, and scenes of daily life. These drums have been found not just in Vietnam, but scattered across a huge area of island and mainland Southeast Asia, suggesting the Dong Son culture was deeply connected through trade, travel, and cultural exchange with numerous surrounding regions, rather than developing in complete isolation. This era is often held up in modern Vietnam as a proud symbol of early, sophisticated, distinctly Vietnamese civilization, and it absolutely deserves that recognition. But genetically speaking, the population responsible for Dong Son culture was itself already a product of those earlier layered migrations we just described, hunter-gatherer ancestry mixed with farmer ancestry from the north, further blended through centuries of contact with neighboring populations, meaning even this celebrated golden age of early Vietnamese civilization was built by people whose DNA already carried the fingerprints of multiple ancient migration waves rather than one single pure point of origin. Now, let's bring this story into the modern era, because the way scientists are studying Vietnamese ancestry today looks completely different from how it was studied even just a decade ago, and the scale of new information being uncovered is genuinely staggering. For a very long time, Vietnam's genetic diversity remained almost completely unstudied on a large scale, especially compared to countries like China, Japan, or South Korea, which had far more genomic research funding and infrastructure. Most early studies that did exist focused almost entirely on the majority Kin population, largely ignoring the dozens of other ethnic minority groups scattered across the country's mountains, highlands, and river deltas. This left a massive gap in scientific understanding, not just for academic curiosity, but for practical medical reasons too, since genetic differences between populations can affect how diseases develop and how people respond to different medications, meaning underrepresented populations often receive less accurate, less personalized healthcare guidance simply because scientists never properly studied their genetic backgrounds in the first place. That gap is finally starting to close in a big way. In 2019, a major research effort called the 1000 Vietnamese Genome Project launched, backed by a large private investment group's research institute, aiming to sequence the complete genetic code of a large sample of Vietnamese individuals and build a proper local reference database that Vietnamese doctors and researchers could actually use, rather than relying entirely on genetic reference data, built primarily from European or East Asian populations that do not always accurately reflect Vietnamese genetic patterns. This effort eventually expanded into the massive VN1K project we mentioned at the very beginning of this video, the study that dropped in the summer of 2026 and sequenced over 1,000 Vietnamese genomes in extraordinary detail, creating what researchers describe as a pangenome resource, essentially a far more complete and flexible genetic reference map built specifically to represent the true diversity found within the Vietnamese population, rather than forcing Vietnamese genetic data to be awkwardly compared against reference genomes built from completely different populations on the other side of the world. And it is not just Vietnamese research institutions pushing into this space. Even major international consumer DNA testing companies have recently expanded their focus on Vietnamese ancestry, specifically because so many people started requesting more detailed, more accurate breakdowns of their family history. In 2026, one of the largest consumer genetics companies in the world announced a significant expansion of their Vietnamese ancestry categories, adding dozens of new detailed genetic groupings specifically designed to help people trace exactly which region of Vietnam their ancestors most likely came from, whether that be the mountainous north, the fertile Red River Delta, the central coastline once home to the Cham Kingdom, or the vast Mekong Delta in the south. This kind of hyper-detailed regional ancestry mapping was simply not possible even a few years earlier, and it reflects a much larger global shift, where DNA testing companies are finally investing serious resources into accurately representing populations that had previously been treated as a single broad, oversimplified category on ancestry reports, when the underlying genetic reality is dramatically more diverse and specific than that. So why does all of this matter so much beyond simple scientific curiosity? Because this entire body of research is quietly rewriting a national origin story that has shaped identity, education, and even politics in Vietnam for generations. There is a fascinating and somewhat uncomfortable angle to this that researchers studying the social side of genetics have specifically pointed out. Vietnam's relationship with its much larger northern neighbor, China, has been shaped by centuries of complicated history, including long periods of Chinese rule in the ancient past, repeated conflicts throughout history, and an ongoing modern relationship that mixes deep economic cooperation with persistent geopolitical tension. Given this backdrop, some researchers have observed that Vietnamese scientific institutions have, at times, used the language and framing of genomic research to help construct a narrative of genetic independence and distinctiveness from China, presenting Vietnamese ancestry as fundamentally its own separate story, rather than an extension of Chinese population history. This makes the actual scientific findings, showing clear ancient genetic connections to populations that once lived in China's Yangtze River Basin thousands of years ago, a genuinely sensitive and complicated topic to present to the public, sitting right at the crossroads of hard science, national identity, and historical memory. It is worth being extremely clear and careful about what the actual science does and does not say here, because this is exactly the kind of nuance that gets lost the moment a topic goes viral online. The genetic connections researchers have identified trace back to farming populations that existed in the Yangtze River region, somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 years ago, long before anything resembling the modern nation-states of China or Vietnam existed in any political sense. These ancient farming populations were themselves the ancestors of an enormous range of different modern populations spread across huge portions of East and Southeast Asia today, not just Vietnamese people specifically. Sharing ancient ancestry with a population from thousands of years ago says absolutely nothing about modern national identity, modern culture, modern language, or any kind of political claim in the present day. Genetics describes deep biological history, stretching across scales of time that are almost impossible for the human mind to fully grasp, while national identity is a completely different kind of story built from shared language, shared culture, shared history, and shared lived experience across recent centuries, not from which ancient population your DNA happens to trace back to tens of thousands of generations ago. Before we move into the modern era of this story, it is worth understanding exactly how scientists became confident enough in this two-layer migration model to publish it as a serious scientific conclusion, rather than just an educated guess, because the evidence behind it is genuinely remarkable. Researchers did not only rely on studying the DNA of people alive today, they also managed to extract and sequence ancient DNA directly from human skeletal remains excavated at archaeological sites scattered across Southeast Asia. Some of these remains thousands of years old, preserved just well enough in the right conditions for modern laboratory techniques to pull out fragments of genetic code. When researchers compared the ancient DNA extracted from early hunter-gatherer skeletons against the DNA extracted from later farming era skeletons found at different archaeological layers in the very same region, the genetic difference between the two groups was clear and measurable, essentially a frozen snapshot of two distinct ancestral populations captured at different points in time, long before they had fully mixed together into the more blended populations we see across the region today. This kind of ancient DNA evidence is exactly why the two-layer model moved from being just one competing theory among several to becoming the leading, well-supported scientific explanation for how modern Southeast Asian populations, including the ancestors of today's Vietnamese people, actually came to exist. There is also a medical dimension to all of this research that rarely gets mentioned in casual conversations about ancestry, but genuinely matters for real people's health and daily lives. Because Vietnam's population carries such a layered, diverse genetic background, shaped by multiple ancient migrations and repeated historical mixing between dozens of distinct ethnic groups, genetic variants linked to certain diseases, certain drug reactions, and certain inherited health conditions can differ noticeably between different regions and ethnic communities within the country itself, not just between Vietnam and other nations. This is precisely why projects like the 1000 Vietnamese Genome Project and the newer VN1K Pangenome Resource matter far beyond simple academic curiosity about ancient history. Doctors and medical researchers working in Vietnam have historically had to rely heavily on genetic reference databases built primarily from European, American, or East Asian populations. Databases that do not always accurately capture the specific genetic variants relevant to Vietnamese patients, sometimes leading to less accurate predictions about disease risk or medication effectiveness. Building a proper, detailed, locally representative genetic database is not just about answering fascinating questions about where people came from thousands of years ago. It is also about giving doctors better tools to protect the health of people living in Vietnam right now, using genetic reference data that actually reflects their own specific ancestral background rather than someone else's. Let's bring in a few more genuinely surprising facts that rarely make it into mainstream conversations about Vietnamese ancestry. Because the deeper you dig into this research, the more layers keep appearing. Researchers studying maternal genetic lineage, meaning DNA passed down specifically through the mother's side across generations, discovered entirely new genetic branches within Vietnamese populations that had never been documented anywhere else in the world before, evidence of historical gene flow connecting Vietnamese populations with neighboring countries in ways that had not been previously traced through DNA analysis. Other researchers studying two specific ethnic minority groups in Vietnam, known as the Mang and the Silla, found something genuinely striking, evidence that both of these small communities went through significant population bottlenecks relatively recently in their history, meaning at some point in the past, their population size shrank dramatically, likely due to disease, conflict, migration pressure, or some combination of these factors, before slowly recovering again over subsequent generations. These kinds of bottleneck events leave permanent detectable fingerprints in a population's DNA for a very long time afterward, essentially a genetic scar revealing hardship endured by a community's ancestors long before anyone was writing that history down in books. There's also something genuinely humbling in all of this research, a reminder about just how incomplete our scientific understanding of human history still is, even in the current era of advanced genome sequencing technology. For decades, Vietnam remained one of the most understudied countries in the entire field of human population genetics, despite its enormous ethnolinguistic diversity and its strategically important location at the crossroads of major ancient migration routes connecting South Asia, East Asia, and the vast island world of the Pacific. This means that even now in 2026, researchers are only beginning to properly map out the true complexity of Vietnamese genetic ancestry, and it is entirely possible, honestly quite likely, that future studies using even larger sample sizes and even more advanced sequencing technology will continue to reveal new twists, new migration connections, and new details that nobody has fully documented yet. The story we have just walked through, hunter-gatherers arriving 44,000 years ago, farmers migrating south from the Yangtze region roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, Austronesian seafarers settling the central coast, repeated mixing between Tai Kadai and Hmong Mien communities, isolated population bottlenecks among smaller ethnic groups. This is genuinely just the current best understanding based on available data, not necessarily the final, complete picture. So when that VN1K research paper dropped in July 2026 and set off waves of reaction across Vietnamese social media, what people were really reacting to was not some shocking secret hidden away by scientists for decades. They were reacting to the simple, sometimes uncomfortable truth that human ancestry, for absolutely every population on this planet, without exception, is almost never a single clean story. It is always layered, always mixed, always shaped by countless migrations, contacts, and unions between different groups of people stretching back across tens of thousands of years, long before anyone had drawn borders on a map or given a name to a nation. Vietnamese ancestry carries the deep imprint of ancient hunter-gatherers who first walked into Southeast Asia's forests tens of thousands of years ago, the imprint of farming communities who migrated south, bringing rice cultivation thousands of years later, the imprint of seafaring Austronesian settlers who crossed vast stretches of ocean to reach the central coastline, and the imprint of centuries of contact and mixing between dozens of distinct ethnic and linguistic communities living side by side across mountains, deltas, and coastlines. That is the real answer to where Vietnamese people actually come from. And honestly, it is a far richer, far more fascinating story than the simplified version most people grew up believing. It is not a story about purity or a single unbroken bloodline. It is a story about survival, migration, adaptation, and connection, written directly into the DNA of every single person carrying Vietnamese ancestry today, whether they realize it or not. One last thing worth sitting with before we wrap up. Every single population on this planet has a version of this exact same story hiding inside their own DNA, waiting to be uncovered by the next big genome project. The specific details change from place to place. Different migration routes, different ancient farming waves, different periods of contact and mixing. But the underlying pattern repeats itself again and again across human history. Everywhere, researchers have looked closely enough to find it, nobody's ancestry is actually a single, pure, unbroken line stretching back into the mist of prehistory. Every group of people alive today is the product of repeated waves of movement, encounter, and mixing between different populations, stretching back tens of thousands of years, long before anyone had invented the concept of nations, borders, or ethnic identity as we understand it now. Vietnam's story simply happens to be one of the more dramatic, more thoroughly documented examples currently coming into focus, precisely because so much fresh scientific attention and funding has finally been directed toward properly studying it. And as scientists continue digging deeper into this genetic history with better tools and bigger studies every single year, there's a very good chance the full picture is still nowhere near complete, meaning the real story of Vietnamese origins is still being written, one genome at a time.